Hello, everyone, and my name is Misty Gaither, and welcome to Quest, a journey into true crime and the paranormal. And I am so excited tonight to welcome my very special guest, Lise Olsen. Now, for those of you who do not know Lise Olsen, I am just going to read, I think it is like a couple of sentences that sums up her career and just what an incredible investigator and person that she is. And it says that Lisa's reports in 3 states over 20 years contributed to the prosecutions of a former congressman and a federal judge, inspired laws and reforms, helped solve cold cases, restored names to the unidentified murder victims, and freed dozens of wrongfully held prisoners. Just that sentence alone, it just really, I mean, that's impressive to me. And so, how are you doing? And then we'll get back to that.
I'm doing okay. It's been a little bit of a tough holiday because had a loss in my family, but I have been over the years interviewing many people who've had losses, and sometimes, loss is what brings us together. It's part of life, right? I'm here. I'm glad
Unfortunately.
to be here with you now.
Well, I appreciate you being here because I know, about your loss, and I know that you're extremely busy. I don't know if it's weird or me or whatever, but I do research a lot about serial killers and about different cases. And I mean, you're from the Houston area. And for those of you who have any true crime knowledge or any interest, I mean, there's a lot going on just in Houston. I mean, not just the state of Texas, but you could just kind of isolate Houston by itself in that area. And you would have stories, which you do, but I mean, you would have stories for years and years just on that area. You wrote a book called The Code of Silence, and it was an award winner. Tell me about the book.
There was a judge on Galveston Island who was the only federal district judge on that specific courthouse. And we heard a rumor one day in the newsroom that his case manager, the woman who was sort of his right-hand person, had run crying from his office and literally hidden in the courthouse from him. And the rumors that were going on around the courthouse were that he had tried to rape her. It's just really shocking, kind of story that we at first thought there's no way we can prove this, and how can it possibly be true that someone like that who's picked by a president and vetted by Congress could do something like that? And if so, how would anyone ever manage to tell us about it? And we ended up, I worked with another reporter who originally got the tip, who was covering the courts, and we ended up finding out that this judge had a long record of abuse of power that had culminated in this, very drunken, violent attack on this woman who had worked for him for several years. Ultimately, I persuaded her to talk to me and ended up doing a story about the amazing amount of power that federal judges have, and how when one goes so south, like he did, first drinking and then having mental illness episodes and then finally carrying out attacks like this, that other judges were sort of initially inclined to sort of circle the ranks and protect him because the federal judiciary has so much power, and they do really rely on their reputations, and their system of investigating what happens when things go wrong relies on one judge investigating another. And so that was what I ended up writing. I wrote about how this judge went wrong and how the system works, the secret system that protected him. And then women like Kathy McBroom, who was the woman who he attacked, who finally ended up standing up to him and blowing the whistle, bringing him down ultimately. He was impeached, had to resign, went to prison. And around the same time, actually, there was a judge in New Orleans who sort of went down the same path.
No
He was
doubt.
not Judge Porteous. Hmm.
Yeah.
So it was he didn't rape anyone, but he certainly drank a lot and went wrong. So that whole system of the judiciary having too much power and not enough accountability is what I wrote about in that book. But I mean, it's a book about a woman standing up to power, and that's part of what really attracted me to that story is, the whistleblowers who risk it all to really expose things like that. I think those are the stories that really call to me, and those are the stories I really want to tell.
You were saying about the judge in Galveston, how that he had like a history once that you got into it. The incident with, I believe her name was McBroom, you said, Kathy?
Yeah.
Okay. The incident with Miss McBroom, it wasn't his first time. It wasn't his first rodeo. And that is the same thing with like serial killers. You can see the pattern and when stuff happens and you're like, oh, I bet that's not the first time that they killed. And, they have a long pattern of abuse and causing a lot of mayhem and everything. So, I mean, you're currently still at the Texas Observer
Yes,
as
I'm the
their,
investigation editor at the Texas Observer.
and then you were before that at the Houston Chronicle. Let's talk about serial killers for a moment. Now, you're working on a new book, or it's going to be out in April, and I'm really excited about it. It's called The Scientist and the Serial Killer. And from what I gathered in my research, is Sharon Derrick, who is a forensic anthropologist. She was at a Houston morgue and she found a box of human remains that was marked 1973. And so there was all these bones and different remains that were in the box. And then was it marked at the time that this had to do with the Dean Corll case, or was that found out later?
The boxes, there were three boxes, and they were really mysterious boxes, like you said, up on a shelf. And the cold storage in the morgue in Harris County, they said 1973 mass murders.
Okay.
And that's what they called the Dean Corll murder case back in the 70s, because they didn't yet have the term serial killer. So they really didn't know what to call someone like him who stalked, hunted, used other people to entrap young teenage boys, kidnapped them, killed them, tortured them. They didn't know what to call this guy. And so initially for a long time they were labeled the Houston mass murders. So when she saw that, Sharon Derrick remembered that name, the Houston mass murders, as a notorious case from her own childhood. She remembered being a teenager and reading about Dean Corll, and these were cases that terrified teenagers, I think, all over the country, but especially teenagers in Texas who knew that this guy had been literally cruising around local teen hangouts, going to the beach, inviting kids to parties, going to roller rinks, going to movie theaters, and not attracting the attention of the authorities when these kids went missing. And so this was a story that had lived in her memory as a terrifying episode. So when she saw that label, which seemed generic to probably some other people, it right away made her think of these horrible cases that she had read about as a kid.
Now, Dean Corll, his moniker is the Candyman that he was known by. And so in 73, I mean, it was, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was in the 20s, like 20 something that he murdered. And I mean, I'm not going into the detail here, but you can research it and read the story about it. And it's so sad about what he did to those young boys. How the torture and the ultimate death and how, I mean, even two of them were brothers. And so, and they were killed at different times. And I think at the time, though, if I'm not wrong, like people wasn't putting it together. Like people, like young boys, teenage were going missing, but they didn't really like connect it at the time.
You're absolutely right, Misty. There were 27 bodies found right away. Not all of them were identified. And Dr. Sharon Derrick, who we talked about earlier, she ultimately found that there were even more victims. But at the time, 27 was a Texas state record and considered kind of a record in modern American murder history. It made international news. But yeah, in Houston, the kind of shocking thing was they had not opened a murder case. Most of these boys had been classified as runaways, even though there were boys who were on that list. As you say, there were actually two sets of brothers in the
Okay.
27. Two of them disappeared at the same time, and two of them disappeared on two separate days. And I think in that case, the first brother disappeared, and the second brother went looking for him
Mm-hmm.
and instead was killed. Kind of shocking looking back that many kids could go missing, including sets of brothers. and the police wouldn't realize that there was something going on. And a huge number of those kids, the majority of them, were from neighborhoods in near downtown Houston, the Heights, which was, a little bit like it, as the moniker suggests, was a little bit higher on higher ground in Houston. And neighborhoods around that neighborhood were where most of these kids lived. So they were from the same part of town. And so it was really shocking that the police had not picked up on any pattern. In fact, there were five, six, seven of them that lived within 2 blocks of 2 or 3 blocks of where Coral's main accomplice, Wayne Henley, grew up. So there was a really cluster of victims within just a couple of blocks of each other. It's kind of incomprehensible looking back that they would not have opened a murder case or taken these disappearances more seriously. But if I was trying to, and I spent a lot of time talking to kids who grew up in the 70s who knew these kids, recreating their worlds and talking about, what was the atmosphere like? How could this possibly have happened? And certainly there were most of the parents had immediately reported these kids missing, but there were numbers and numbers of missing kids in the 70s. Some of them were going off to evade the draft to Canada. Some of them were moving to other states. Some of them were joining some kind of religious cults that were kind of popping up called Jesus people. I mean, there were all kinds of things going on. It was a little bit, there weren't as many sort of quote hippies around, but there were a lot of people moving around and moving away. And there wasn't a cell phone, there wasn't email. So people would sometimes leave, particularly older teens, and they wouldn't stay in touch with their families. So the police wouldn't necessarily take these seriously. But, there were kids who disappeared without a dime in their pocket. There were kids who disappeared who left their prized, Mustang parked on the street. Why would an 18-year-old, quote, run away and leave their Mustang parked? Why would a 18-year-old run away when he had just gotten engaged to be married and when he was about to graduate from Waltrip High School in a few weeks? And why would he not collect his last paycheck from his manager's job at a Lone Star, Long John Silver's if he ran away? So there were lots of questions about why the police didn't take these cases more seriously that were raised in retrospect when those bodies were found. But I think, the part that to me really remains even more shocking and why I thought it was still worth writing a book about it is, as we talked about in the beginning, 30 years later, Dr. Sharon Derrick finds that there are all these boxes of bones, and about a third of the victims had either been misidentified or not identified at all. That was the part that really shocked her. She had aunts and uncles and cousins and her grandparents who had lived in the Heights. She knew that there was a neighborhood that in the 70s people still knew each other, they knew their neighbors. She couldn't believe that these kids had not been identified. And she thought that surely, with all the new technology she had, she would be able finally to bring these kids home, give their families answers and get them out of the morgue. And that's what the book is about. And it's also about, why those kids were somehow got forgotten in one way or another by society, how it is that some kids were identified and others were not. And I think those are lessons that, are still really important to our world today. We still have too many unidentified persons in the United States, too few resources for death investigations, and that still allows serial killers to go undetected, people to go unidentified, and murders to go unsolved. And there's a great need for more resources, and it's just their resources just aren't there. And so I think there's a lot of other stories probably like this, not necessarily as extreme, in terms of the numbers of victims of one killer,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of stories that of people who are unidentified who should not be. And that's something that has troubled me for a lot of my career, and that's why I wrote about this case.
Back then, we didn't have the DNA, process. We didn't have the genetic genealogy. We didn't, I think back then was probably just your blood type kind of sealed. like what was go like to identify or dental or it was really bare bones. What?
Well, bare bones, so to
Yes.
speak.
Yeah.
Really good. I mean, good point. It's interesting because Houston, Harris County had one of the first medical examiner's offices in Texas, and they had one of the best MEs in the state. So, in terms of 1973, they were state of the art. And what they were doing, which is pretty amazing, and I interviewed a woman who was a young woman in the office at the time, Pat Paul, who later became an investigator, and she was there when they were doing all this. They really relied on dental records. So the kids who were a little bit more from a little bit wealthier families who had gone to the dentist and had dental records or dental x-rays, those kids they could identify easier because they
Hmm.
were able to use that technology, which still remains a big identification tool, to identify a bunch of those boys because most of them were only bones by the time they were found. Even the kids who had been only murdered a few weeks or months at the time their bodies were found in August 1973, the heat in Houston, heat of the Gulf Coast, the decomposition process is so fast that there was no way to identify them from their facial features. They were no longer recognizable, but the teeth were there, and that was the main way they were able to identify a lot of these kids, along with bones, broken bones. For example, there were a couple of kids who had either cracked or broken a bone, and they had X-rays from the hospital visits. And that was the other thing they used. So they really tried
Sure.
in 1973, but they didn't have enough tools for sure.
So how many remains unidentified now?
Well, the book tells you about some identifications that have
Okay.
been made that haven't even been announced
Oh,
yet.
all
And
right.
so, when you read this
Excuse me.
book, you're going to find out about the
Okay.
identities of two of Dean Corll's victims that have never been announced by the Harris County authorities that Sharon Derrick and others she worked with were able to confirm, but for one reason or another, they weren't announced. One of them was a young boy named Donnie Falcon, who's originally from Corpus Christi, who was a surfer and who apparently fought Dean Corll. He was a more recent arrival in Houston, and his name didn't get on the missing persons list at that time. But he was one of the victims. They were able to match his DNA to his sister's
Wow.
under Dr. Derrick's work. And then there's another identification that is still formally pending, but there is a genetic genealogy match between what is considered to be the last unidentified victim, who is called Swimsuit Boy.
Yeah,
And
swimsuit boy. I remember, they really are about to close that. Like they're going to find out who he is.
in the book, I tell you that there is apparently a mix-up between him and another victim that was previously identified. And the theory that's in the book is that he is actually a police officer's son, a Houston police officer's son,
Wow.
and that the police officer's son who was identified back in the 80s, the person buried in his grave is probably a different victim. So that's a twist that's in the book. So I'm a little spoiler alert there.
Yeah.
But if you read the book, you'll learn about some things that have never been announced by the authorities and why. And I think part of it has to do with, there's just not resources for some of these cold cases. And even especially in these cases where they're solved, right? If somebody's already in prison, like Coral was dead,
Hmm.
Coral was killed by one of his accomplices,
Right.
and his two accomplices were put in prison for these murders. They were both teenagers. So there's really no real pressure on the authorities to identify more victims. They were able to convict, these boys with six of the murders. They used some of the strongest IDs to convict those two other teenagers of these murders. And they really didn't need all these other victims' identities. I can't say they didn't care, but they didn't need that evidence. So there weren't resources to get to the bottom of who they all were. And I think that's a really shocking thing. And the other thing is there's really strong evidence that there is still remains in the site where some of these victims were found in 1973, which is private property in Houston, that the owners do not want to be searched again, even though Dr. Derrick and others have requested permission to search, and there's evidence that there are additional remains there. A private party like that can say no. There's no active murder case, so there's no way under the law for the relatives of some of these families to say, look, we want to know if the rest of our loved ones' bones are at this site, which is one of the stories I tell you about in the book, is that Donnie's relatives is pretty strong evidence that some of his remains are still in the boat shed area where some of these victims were found in 1973. And there's no legal remedy for that family to recover those remains or for anyone else to try to conduct a search to see if there are additional victims still buried at that same site. To me, that's sort of shocking. Now, if it was public property, of course, there would be a way to do it. But on private property, there doesn't seem to be any legal mechanism.
Maybe that can be changed, but I do want to go, I'll hold that thought and we'll get back to how people react about searching and denying. I don't know what was going on in the Houston, Galveston area in the 70s because you have Dean Corll, the Candyman, 28, at least 28 boys that were murdered. You have him going on in the early 1970s, and then you have the Texas killing fields, the Calder Road that has the four bodies, Laura Miller, Heidi, or as her family calls her, Heidi Fye. They found two, a Janet Doe and a Jane Doe, and then they were identified. So you had that going on, and those were like the early 80s. But the show that you were on called The 11 for the serial killer Edward Harold Bell, and that also was in the 70s.
Ed Bell, and this is really how I ended up writing about Dr. Derrick's work, is that I was investigating the unidentified in Houston. Why did we have so many unidentified dead? And I was writing about an effort by the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office to identify some of these cold case unidentifieds. And there was a teenager who was found floating in a lake near Galveston, Clear Lake area near NASA, who was wearing a Galveston surf shop t-shirt, but not all the bones were found in the same place. And when I wrote about that case and I wrote about some other cases, I was doing it as kind of a public service because I knew that sometimes if reporters write about cases and specific clues like tattoos or jewelry or IDs or things like that, that there is a chance sometimes that family members can have their memories jogged or the story ends up on the internet and identifications can result. So I did the story for that reason. A police officer called me about that young girl and he said, I think that girl was the victim of an unsolved serial killer. And I think that the perpetrator was a guy named Ed Bell. And I'd never heard of Ed Bell. And when I looked up the 1970s at the time there were a lot of stories that put together the Killing Fields murders, which you were talking about, that occurred in the 80s, with these older unsolved cases from the 70s. But when I started meeting with this detective, whose name is Fred Page, who was
Yes.
at that time working for the Galveston police and then later retired, Fred had gathered a whole lot of information about these 11 girls' cases. And they were from the early 1970 to about 1978 or 9, and then they stopped the murders. And at that time, Bell, this guy he thought had committed the murders, had gone on the lam. He had killed a Marine he was a flasher. He was what we would call a serial sex offender. He was somebody who approached young women in cars and exposed himself or propositioned them, chased them. There were all kinds of police reports about him chasing people, about him raping someone who had left the mental hospital in Galveston. He had been abducted at gunpoint. He was a bad guy, and he had killed this Marine who had confronted him when he was approaching a group of girls and exposing himself and propositioning them and touching himself. And he had multiple weapons he was carrying around in his car, pulled out these weapons and shot this Marine in front of his mother in cold
Yeah.
blood and in front of these kids. And then he went on the lam, and that is when the murders that Fred Page was tracking stopped. And
Yes.
then, quite a few years later, we have the bodies dumped in what is called the killing fields in Calder Road. And he said, I think the Calder Road murders were done by someone else. I think these murders were done by Ed Bell. And I said, well, why do you think that? And he said, well, Ed Bell confessed. And he said he produced a letter that Ed Bell had sent to the DA's office. And you're absolutely right. Kind of astonishingly, in the 70s, there were at least two serial killers at work in Houston, maybe three. One who was targeting young girls from Galveston to Clear Lake along the 45 corridor.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Dean Corll in Houston at the same years, killing teenage boys. But this guy, Ed Bell, had actually, once he was arrested for this murder of the Marine, he fled to Panama. He lived
Yeah.
in a sailboat for a few years. He was finally caught when there was a show did a story about the unsolved murder of the Larry Dickens, the Marine, and he was caught in Panama and brought back. And when he was caught in Panama and brought back, he sent a letter to the DA in Galveston confessing in detail to the murders of two girls in Galveston and naming them and giving details of the crime that by then was 23 or 24 years in the past. Some people said later, well, he must have made it up. But I said, it was before the internet, was popular. He had been living in Panama. How did he remember the details of a 24-year-old murder to be able to write a confession letter like that? So he sent that to the DA's office, and he said that these were only two of the murders that
Mm-hmm.
he had committed. And they proceeded to provide some details of some other murders. I listened to this story from this Galveston police officer, and I said, well, what happened? How come he wasn't prosecuted? And he said, well, Ed Bell never talked again. He's never talked to any police officer. They couldn't find corroborating evidence. Some of these cases were already so old by the time they arrested him that some of the physical evidence had been lost. But I still think that this case could be solved, if somebody went and talked to Ed Bell and if we looked back and tried to see if any of the old case files had any DNA, things we could test for DNA, there still might be a chance to solve it. And he said, I can't get permission to go talk to Ed Bell, but I bet you could. So he kind of dared me to go talk to Ed Bell. And
Right.
that started a series of conversations I had with the guy who was undoubtedly one of the strangest people I've ever come
Creepiest.
to in my life.
Yeah. The show that we're referring to that Lisa and Fred were, it was on A&E and it was called The 11 because the poem was called The 11 that went to heaven. And he had detailed about, different, it put like little hints around some of them's names, like Kim Pitchford, like she had a black fur coat on or something like that. And, he would make little references to them. And
That's right.
I really, I was watching you, like your facial expression and how you tried to remain stoic when you were talking to him because he was so disgusting and just so creepy, and how he would talk about some of the victims because sometimes he would allude to, yeah, I did it, and then sometimes, no, I can't say that because I want to have immunity because in his mind he thought he was going to eventually get out of prison. But your face, some things that he would say, I could see you sometimes, maybe a little bit angry, a little bit disgusted. I knew that you were in there trying to get all the information that you could, but I could tell, just by watching it, I wonder how it took a toll on you to be around that evil and around that. You put yourself there so that you could help other people and bring comfort to the families. Now, you were talking about how that, the serial killers, they had at least two going on in the 70s. Dean Corll, possibly Edward Harold Bell. Do you think they knew each other? And I'm gonna tell you why I wonder that.
I think that's a really good question, and I really don't know. I mean, I know that Dee Coral would go to the beach, certainly, and took teenagers to the beach. He did take kids surfing. Ed Bell co-owned a surf and dive shop in Galveston. I never found anything that put them together, but it's not impossible that they knew each other in some way or another. I mean, there's a lot of things that are really creepy about Ed Bell, and
Sure.
like you said, the only reason I ever talked to him was I wondered if there was any chance that Fred Page was right, that if I talked to Ed Bell, we might be able to help solve these murders. And I knew there were a lot of families who were still around,
Excuse me.
particularly siblings,
Right.
who really wanted answers on these cases. And so the first time I went to see Ed Bell was when he sent me the letter where he wrote that poem, The 11 That Went to Heaven.
Right.
And it was at the end of a long conversation with him that he started talking about, yes, I did kill them. And he started giving me lists of clues and numbers. And I think my first two or three conversations with him, I had about the best chance to get him to talk to me. But the frustrating part was I always had only like an hour because media interviews in prisons are an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And, you get to a point where you're getting some revelations, and then suddenly they say, time's up, you have to leave. And so there was a lot of moments when I would be talking to Ed and he would be talking about something that made no sense, or he would be bragging about how he was sexually attractive to the girls he killed in Galveston. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why they went with him, that they had sex with him voluntarily
Sure. Yeah.
on the day they died, and that he didn't know who killed them. I mean, things like that. Certainly, that was really hard for me not to react to that kind of boast. He was an incredibly terrible person. But the thing I wanted to say is that, there was another weird factor about Ed, which is he claimed that he had been experimented on
Right.
in the 60s, and he was put in a mental hospital. And as you probably know, I think, people who have looked at history of murder in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s know that there was experimentation on prisoners and on some military personnel in the late 60s and early 70s involving mind controlling drugs, involving different kinds of narcotics, different kind of hallucinogenics. And there's some documentation about that. And I can't tell you that Ed Bell was lying when he said I was experimented on,
Right.
and there was efforts to turn me into a killer. And I can tell you that Dean Corll was briefly in the army, and people say he was not violent or abnormal as a young boy. I'm sure he was gay,
Mm-hmm.
but that didn't make him violent. And it was after he left the army that he started killing. That is the only thing that's on the extreme end of, what I would say could potentially connect them in any way at all. Were either of these men experimented on? I have no idea.
And what made me think if, I wonder if they knew each other was because, the Long Island serial killer, Rex, and the Happy Face killer, Keith Jefferson or something like that's his last name.
Mhm.
They've communicated since he's been arrested. But that just made me wonder: did Dean Coral and Ed Bell know each other, or in
I,
some
I,
way?
you know,
You don't know.
I have no known, there's no known connection that I know of,
Right?
except that they were actively killing people during the same years. They both did go to the beach. That's the only thing I know
Yeah.
that would have at all connected them. They grew up in different parts of Texas. Ed Bell went to Texas A&M for college. Dean Corll went brief. He grew up in Houston, but then went to Vidor briefly,
Mm-hmm.
and for high school, and attended the University of Houston briefly. He was in the Army for a short period of time.
Right.
Ed Bell was never in the Army. I don't know that they knew each other at all.
Right. What I also found interesting is because if you look at like chronologically of the murders of the 11, and there's a gap between 1971 and 1973. And do you know where he was in 1972? I found a mugshot of him, and he was here in New Orleans area.
Yes, he was in New Orleans,
Yeah,
you're right.
in
And he,
1972.
yeah, and he was stopped in a white, he had one of his, he like Dean Corll drove the white
The white
vans. That
van.
would be the only thing they had in common. Of
Right,
course, those panel vans were common at the
right,
time, and
right,
stuff, right?
right.
But they both drove those kind of vans, and they definitely used them to abduct people. And you're absolutely right. He was in New Orleans. Ed Bell was in New Orleans for a period in the early 70s. And the other thing about Ed Bell is there's no question that the other thing Ed Bell claimed was that his father worked for the federal government in some capacity,
Hmm.
and that Ed Bell claimed that he had been used by the government somehow. Ed Bell in the 70s was in contact with people who were at the Bay of Pigs.
Oh, okay.
He was a co-owner of land in the Big Bend area that was connected to an airfield where that was used for smuggling arms to Central America by the CIA and other agencies. So
Hmm.
there were some weird connections that he had. I have no idea what he was doing in New Orleans in 72. We looked to see, if we could find any other murders
Right.
in New Orleans that might fit his pattern. We weren't able to,
Yeah, I couldn't
necessarily.
find any either because I did look also, during
Yeah,
that
and,
time.
and there are unsolved murders in Central America, but
Yes.
the ability to connect him to those was severely limited by the accessibility to records, particularly in Panama, which had been under a dictatorship
Right.
during the years that he was there, because he was in Panama for quite a while. And before that, he was in Costa Rica. I'm certain that Ed Bell, if he did what he said he did, and I think in 11, Fred and I put together a pretty convincing amount of circumstantial evidence to corroborate the fact that Ed Bell certainly could have killed the 11 girls that he named or partially named or described. And there were things that connected him to the burial sites. There were things that connected him to those girls. There was certainly a lot of information he gave us that connected him to the two murders of two girls in Galveston that Fred had himself investigated. There were so many connections between him and very obscure locations where those girls' bodies were buried. And his MOs and the known crimes that he had committed, where the victims had survived, the connections were incredibly, in my mind, very strong, and it was very disturbing. And so, certainly, if he had committed those 11 murders, which he claimed he had committed, although, like you said, he later recanted because he thought he could get out of prison if he
Sure.
recanted and pretended to be a nice old man. Um, he That didn't work.
Yeah.
Um,
No, he couldn't. He's not that great of an actor.
no, no, and very interesting too is I have also interviewed people who have innocence claims, and it's always interesting kind of to if you get a chance to talk to the warden or the assistant warden or the guards who know those people and kind of over time the number of times I interviewed Ed Bell, I did talk to the warden, at the prison where he was, and
Mhm.
he said, I have no doubt he's telling the truth.
Right.
I mean, it was, they thought he was a real scary, what, didn't disbelieve his claims to be a killer.
Well,
Um,
well, Lisa, you know what? I could talk to you, I swear, like 10 hours. I really could. Maybe 15, because I just find it so interesting and then just engrossing. I mean, you're amazing, for all that you do, and you do it for the people and those that, that don't have a voice. And you've helped so many. And I just want to say thank you for that. And I hope that maybe that you could come back in a future date and we can talk some more about all this. But the scientist and the serial killer will be out April the 1st. Is that right? Is it
it'll be out
April?
April the 1st, and
Yeah.
there's going to be book events in Texas, and I'm hoping for one in Louisiana next summer. So
Yeah.
maybe I'll meet you there.
That would be
Uh,
so cool. Wow.
Yeah,
That would be
I'm
cool.
glad to be with you. I'm glad to be talking with you about this, and thank you for, these subjects are important. They're troubling, but the more people care about missing persons and unidentified persons, I think the more cases like this will be solved and the more families that will get answers. So I thank you for doing this show. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. So everybody, you can go to Lisa's website, which is Lisa Olsen. Is that right?
Yeah.
LisaOlsen.com. And you can pre-order the book, or can you? It'll be available April the 1st to buy.
Yeah, it's Lisa Olsen, LiseOlsen.com. And it's available now for pre-order. But yes, April 1st, you will be able to get copies right away and
Yay.
signed copies if you come to one of my events. So
All right. Well, I definitely will, especially when you're down this way. But I appreciate it, and everybody be sure to check that out. Watch the 11. I know that it's on Hulu, and it's very wonderful, and just and then also it's on Netflix. It's the crime scene, about the Texas killing fields, and that's just another credible story. And I wish that we had more time because, like I said, we could just
yeah,
we
yeah,
could go back and forth. It would really do.
that is the case where there were recent identifications that we hope will lead to the identity of the murderer and the two, like you said, there were two women that were just recently identified
Yeah,
in
over
that
30.
murder.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
It's, it's just amazing. So thank you so much, and everybody, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it, and I will see you next week.